Yeah, I need her to fix my collar. Okay. All right. So we are in our book, Mind Your Faith by Doy Moyer. We're on page 185, chapter 21, which is the second part of Can We Trust the Bible? We've been going through some of these questions that Doy has brought up regarding regarding history and what historians ask regarding historical documents and the type of things that they examine when it comes to determining the legitimacy or the veracity of historical documents. We've covered the first 6, and we ended last week on the 7th. Are the documents reasonably self-consistent and consistent with other documents that tell about the same events? And this is as it pertains to, first of all, each book being in harmony with itself. Okay, anyone who's read the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price and Doctrines and Covenants, I think it is, for Joseph Smith, when you read those 3 books by Joseph Smith, you'll find within each one numerous contradictions, okay? Contradictions in themselves. But then when you compare the 3 together, there's even more contradictions where Pearl of Great Price will contradict the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon will contradict Pearl of Great Price and Doctrines and Covenants and so forth. And so it kind of is one of those things that goes to show that this certainly wasn't divinely inspired by God, because God doesn't make mistakes. The question that Doy makes or offers is, are they self-consistent with each other? And are they harmonious or consistent with other books of the in our context of the New Testament? Because we're talking about the Gospels. And yes, as we talked about last week, we noted the fact that yes, they are consistent with themselves and with each other. And there's one particular point that he makes that I think is very important to bring out, is that first paragraph for number 7 on page 184. He says, internally, if an account of something is filled with inconsistencies, then it won't be considered so reliable. Each gospel account, when considered on its own merits, is self-consistent. What critics have more trouble with is how the gospel accounts relate to each other. There are both similarities and differences, particularly between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And critics often point to alleged discrepancies between the Gospels to maximize or to minimize the Gospel's credibility. Some think that the differences represent irreconcilable conflicts. And, of course, a lot of that has to do with, wait a minute, are there plausible explanations for why, for instance, as we talked about with the genealogy of Jesus, there's one genealogy in Matthew, there's a different one in Luke. Is there a plausible explanation as to why there's 2 different genealogies? And as we discussed, yeah, one is of Joseph and one is of Mary, showing both lineages, both lines from both supposed parents. Certain Mary was his mother. But also in the first paragraph on page 185, there's another point that he makes. He said, that said, it's important to recognize the difference between a difficulty and a true contradiction. Because a lot of us hear whether it's on some of these documentaries, the lost books of the Bible, maybe even from people we've talked to about the Bible, that the Bible is full of contradictions. Well, in logic, the law of non-contradiction says that something cannot be both what it is and what it isn't at the same time and in the same sense. We grant that there are difficulties. There are scenarios that take thought process to consider what's a plausible explanation, for instance, the 2 genealogies of Jesus. Those who we grant that there are difficulties, but a contradiction means that there are mutually exclusive statements that cannot be reconciled because there are no plausible explanations. And I think it's important to reinforce or emphasize that particular definition for what a contradiction is. These are mutually exclusive statements that cannot be reconciled. Okay? What people bring up, for instance, about how Abraham was justified by faith in Romans, but he was justified by works in James. Well, context bears out that both are correct. Okay, Abraham was promoting the concept of faith over just doing the works and going through the motions as if that was enough to make one righteous, and it wasn't. James, however, was emphasizing the importance of obedience, and that faith without works, faith without obedience, is dead. And so both are consistent. In fact, James even says that it was fulfilled that Abraham believed God, it was accounted to him for righteousness when Abraham offered Isaac on the altar. The committing himself to do the work, the commandment of the Lord, but he did it in faith. And so those are the types of examples sometimes people will bring up, and they'll say, well, these contradict one another. But as Doy points out, those are not mutually exclusive statements that don't have plausible explanations. It's the understanding of context. And of course, that's one thing that's lost on a lot of people today. Those who charge the scriptures with error need to be able to show either that there is a clear contradiction or that statements do not comport with reality in some way. However, such charges against the Bible have not been sufficiently sustained. Much of what are considered to be discrepancies are answered by the literary and cultural context of the documents. New Testament scholar Ben Witherington noted, taking into account all contextual issues and all conventions that I know of that were operative in the day and the time of the New Testament writers, I have yet to find a single example of a clear violation of the principle of non-contradiction in the New Testament. I think that's a really important statement. That when people claim that there are contradictions in the Gospels, and this is another one of those examples that if somebody makes that claim, don't let them kind of use it or regurgitate it as a cop-out or an excuse. Ask them, okay, well, what do you mean? I'd like to know what these contradictions are. Odds are they probably won't have any off the top of their head because they're just repeating what they've heard others say. But if they do bring up something specific, it'll open up an avenue, open up a door to be able to talk to people and say, okay, yeah, Paul does say that Abraham was justified by faith, and James says that Abraham was justified by works. Why don't we sit down and we look at it? Because I believe that they're in harmony with each other. And they're bringing out two different aspects of serving God. But it's one of those types of situations that instead of letting people just say, oh, well, there's contradictions in the Bible, and that just kind of is their blanket reason or one of their reasons for not believing in the Bible or looking further into it, ask them for some specifics. And like I said, odds are they're not going to be able to come up with any. They may have to get back to you, but that's something that might be an opportunity. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir. Right.
Are similar, but it was a really good book that explains a lot of those things that helps us who don't have as much understanding as we should
Right.
see some of those.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. In fact, I think I have that book on my bookshelf. It's been a while since I've looked at it. But yeah, 101 contradictions. In fact, there's several other books written by commentators and preachers and so forth that kind of go through some of the most popular statements or alleging contradictions and kind of goes through and discusses how would I respond to somebody who talks about this. That might be something to look at a later point when we're done with Mind Your Faith. At some point might be something interesting to study as well. Anything else through number 7? All right, number 8. Are the recorded events believable? And when I first read through chapter 21, I got to number 7 and read, are the recorded events believable? And I laughed because I thought to myself, before I even read the paragraph, that goes back to what Doy was talking about earlier with presuppositions. Well, it depends on what you define as believable. And that's really what that goes to. And the very first thing he says, probably here more than any other question, the role of presuppositions comes back into play. Whether or not we consider something believable depends on what we allow as part of our worldview reality. If a person isn't going to think of miracles as believable, then no. What you read is not going to be believable. If you don't believe that there is a God, and you're not going to allow any historical document to move you, then it's not going to matter. You're not going to see them as believable, Old Testament or New Testament for that matter. But I like how Dewey kind of goes back. He boils it down to basic questions. In the first paragraph of page 186, he says, is it believable that there is a God who created humankind? Now, that is perhaps the most fundamental, most basic question that you can ask, ultimately. And especially when you're trying to figure out maybe somebody that you know at school or at work, and you're trying to figure out how to talk to them, you want to try to find the basis of common understanding on which to build. So a lot of times our first questions, if we don't know any background on this individual, our first question is going to be is, do you believe in God? Do you believe there's an almighty creator? Do you believe in an all-powerful God? That's going to be the one most basic question. Well, is it believable? Is it possible? Is it within the realm of possibility that there is a God? Absolutely, yeah, there is, okay? And the point to that is, obviously, nobody can disprove the existence of God any more than we can prove the existence of God via science or any kind of methodology. But is it believable? And that goes to the heart of an individual. If so, then it is believable that this God would want to communicate with us, particularly if we've been made in his image. So if there is a God, then it would make sense that he would communicate with us through some means, a means that could be preserved, a means that could be set forth very clearly. Certainly that's where the Bible certainly is a part of that. If God would want to communicate with us, then it's believable that then is it believable that he as creator has the power to impact and influence events in this world? This is one of the things I don't quite understand about Christian evolutionists. Okay, sometimes you have these, and they go by different phrases, different variations of the name, but in essence, they believe in God and they believe in Jesus, but they believe that God simply started. He was the source of the Big Bang, and then everything evolved over millions and millions of years after that. Okay, well, if you're going to believe that there's an almighty God who isn't limited in his ability or power or knowledge, why is it so hard to believe that he created everything in 6 days at the ages that they seem to be? Why can't he create a universe that's 13 billion years old? If God's all powerful, why would you have to equivocate like that in order to make it fit in your mind? And this kind of goes back to that heart of the thought process of what Doy's talking about. Is it believable that God is sovereign and can intervene in creation at his will? If these things are not believable, then what are believable alternatives? And again, this kind of harkens back to a lot of stuff that Doy's already covered about evolution and so forth. Somebody brings up the humanistic concept that nature itself is a believable alternative. Well, that's where we have to ask, well, can you show evidence for that? Because they can't. They cannot show evidence that nature is alone responsible for everything that exists. Okay, they have supposition, they have assumption. Ultimately, what they have is faith. Okay, really what they have is a religion or a belief all their own. Because it's not based on science, it's based on supposition. And they kind of fill in the blanks where there is observable science, like variation within species, then they assume that that can count towards creating new species. And yet nothing has ever shown that actually happens in nature. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. It says, our answers to these questions will determine whether or not we think miracles are believable. And he quotes from Acts chapter 26 and verse 8 as Paul is standing before Agrippa and he's offering his defense of the gospel. He says, Agrippa, I know that you are aware of these things. These things didn't happen in a corner. And then in verse 8, he says, why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? And of course, this is in context of Jesus being raised. But even before that, Jesus wasn't the first to be raised from the dead. Others had been raised from the dead before. Even the Jews acknowledged and believed that in the Old Testament. There were a couple of occasions where somebody who had died was risen from the dead, either by direct impact from a direct intervention or direct, however you want to say it, by a prophet like Elijah, or even touching the bones was it Elisha's bones or Elijah's bones? I can never remember which one it was. Do I remember it was Elijah's bones? I don't remember. Huh? Oh, that's right. It was Elisha. Yeah, that's right. Elijah was taken up. That's right. Elisha. That's an easy way to remember it. It was Elisha's bones that this individual who had died, he was put into this tomb. He touched Elisha's bones and he was raised from the dead. So this was not something that was beyond the realm of believability by the Jews because God had shown that he was capable of doing it. And that's why Paul brings up in Acts 26 and verse 8, why should it be thought incredible? Why should this not be believable to you that God could raise somebody from the dead? He's done it before. Why can't he continue to do it now? And to that end, why wouldn't he do it for his son? Of course, that's kind of extrapolating more out of what Paul says, but why wouldn't he do it for his son? Of course, Jesus was the first to be raised never to die again. No one else before that, and no one since has. Let's see. Paul applies that once we accept the premises that, or Dewey does, once we accept the premise that God exists and he is sovereign, why would there be a problem with the idea that he can actually do something in his creation? And again, it goes back to basic questions. How far is your friend or your coworker willing to go in terms of believability? Not conviction. We're not asking them, do you believe there is a God? Or do you believe in miracles? We're asking them, is it believable? And if not, why not? And that's really kind of where that stumbling block is for a lot of people, because it's outside of their realm of experience. They've never seen a miracle, so they can't really say that there is such a thing can possibly exist. And to a certain extent, I think there's a lot of people who they don't want to go down that thought process, because if they do, what would they then perhaps have to do? They have to change. Yeah, if they go down that thought process and they begin to believe that there is a God, and they begin to, well, if there is a God, you go down that whole logic train, then certainly God would have given us his will, his word, and if the Bible is his word, then that means I'm doing things wrong and I need to change. And a lot of people aren't willing to go that route. Thoughts or comments to question 8? Question 9 of the 10 that Dewey covers regarding these historical questions, or questions historians often ask about historical documents. Is there other literary evidence to help us establish the reality of the events recorded in the examined documents? So is there anything outside of the Bible, and in this case the New Testament and particularly the Gospels, that correlates with what's recorded, that kind of proves the accuracy of what is written? There's going to be 3 points that Dewey brings up that we have to remember when we consider this point. First of all, we're dealing with ancient history, 2,000 years removed, okay? Which means there's not going to be a great amount of literary evidence for any particular event. And that's going to be true of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. In fact, what is written comes from sources that usually were much later than the people or events in question. But that doesn't necessarily lead historians to discount those records. In particular, because a lot of times ancient historians that lived 100 or 200 years after Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar or whatever are quoting or referring to earlier historical documents that were written that no longer exist. Okay, so sometimes that's the case. For instance, I think we talked about this before, and we will talk about it again in chapter 22. But the book of Hebrews, for instance, what's interesting about the book of Hebrews is that several scholars have noted that due to the extensive nature of quoting the Hebrew letter, even if we had no manuscripts, no copies, no fragments of the book of Hebrews, we could put it all back together just from the quotes over the centuries of what we do have. I think it's amazing to think about that certain scriptures are quoted so often that you wouldn't even have to have a copy of it to know what it said, because it was quoted so much. I just think that's amazing. And in some cases, you have historians referring back to words of Jesus, or some of these individuals referring to words of Paul or whatever. Well, the same is true among historians. They will refer to earlier works. In fact, that happens a lot. And so historians generally don't have a problem with believing historical accounts written by ancient historians, generally speaking. Unless there's some evidence that contradicts it specifically, they usually don't have a problem believing it, even though it's a couple hundred years maybe after the fact. With Bible, obviously, that doesn't apply, but that's generally the case. Anything to that first one? The second thing to remember is that the Gospels were written as independent accounts, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What's sometimes known as as Doy refers to these as independent Gospels, but in particular, these Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John was written in the 90s. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were more contemporary in their writings, even though they weren't necessarily written at the same time. But what Doy brings out is they were not written together and initially passed around together. They stand as separate, autonomous records. And we can add to this Paul in 1 Corinthians as well, which he's already dealt with and will deal with again. But that's the second thing, is that these are all independent, that we put them together because it makes sense to have them together all as one harmony of the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But they weren't, it's not like Matthew, Mark, and Luke sat around together writing their own records or accounts together. That's not what they did. Anything through that one? And then thirdly, with all that in mind, the fact remains that there are other sources that corroborate some of the events of the Bible. These sources include Thallus, Pliny, Suetonius. There's a whole bunch that we've already actually looked at, and there's a whole bunch that he's going to look at as well in a couple more chapters. They don't deal with a whole bunch of the specifics in the Gospels, but what they do corroborate, for instance, they can confirm that Jesus did exist, that he had a brother named James, that he was considered divine by his followers, that he was crucified, and that something else important happened that caused his disciples to flourish. As to what that was, they don't go into the specifics. Of course, we know it was the resurrection, and ultimately, after the church was established on the day of Pentecost, and the proof of that word being confirmed by the miraculous works that the apostles did. But in other words, the core elements of the gospel message are essentially confirmed by non-Christian writings. I think that's pretty important to note. And these aren't individuals who are looking to protect Christianity either. Now, there's a separate section here at the end of chapter 21. He's going to talk about what have opponents written and what have they said about Christianity. But with regard to non-Christian recordings, for instance, Josephus, he wasn't a protector of Christianity. He was a Jew. And so what he recorded that had any type of reference to the Christians or to Jesus or whatnot, he recorded it's historical and it's important because of the events that were taking place, but it wasn't like he was a convert. It wasn't like he was a disciple. And so it's important to kind of recognize that even these individuals who did record about the existence of Jesus, who had a brother named James, and he was divine by his followers, he was crucified and so forth, those aren't things that they wrote in order to corroborate the Gospels. They weren't Christians who corroborated those things, a lot of them. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. Given, and this is kind of interesting too, given that the movement started by Jesus was relatively limited, confined at first to a very small territory, thought of as another sect of the Jews, it's actually significant that anyone paid attention at all in the greater empire. He quotes Boyd and Eddy as they ask, how are we to plausibly account for a movement arising in Palestine within a first century context that was centered on the faith that a recent, wonder-working, wise teacher who had been crucified was actually the saving Messiah and, in fact, the very embodiment of Yahweh himself. Saying that this movement was rooted in a legend simply relabels the problem. It does not solve it. How do you explain that? How do you explain this man named Jesus of Nazareth started this movement that, especially after he died, actually flourished, and people went to their deaths being tortured, professing it, And it has lasted for 2,000 years. What's your explanation for that if it's not true? If it were something that was of man, as Gamaliel points out, if this is of man, it'll come to nothing. But if it's of God, be careful lest you find yourself fighting against God. And there's a lot of wisdom in that, because nothing that man makes lasts. Empires, some of the greatest empires that have ever existed, haven't lasted. None of them will ever last forever. And yet God's word does. Anything through number 9? Yes, sir.
Especially the fact that it jumped ethnic groups.
Yeah.
Religion back then was a very ethnic thing, and Judaism is probably the last remnant we have of that.
Yeah.
Nationality and religion tied together so closely.
Yeah.
So Christianity was the first one to really jump that ethnic group, go to all nations.
That's a great point. Yeah, and why would Gentiles, okay, the Greek-speaking individuals, why would they care about some sect of the Jews that has nothing to do with their gods? Why would they turn their back on the gods of the Romans and the Greeks that they had grown up worshiping if it wasn't for something worthwhile, something that they honestly were convicted was true? And of course, this goes back to one of the purposes of the New Testament miracles, the miraculous works done by Paul, by Peter, the other apostles. And in some cases, those on whom they laid hands on as well, like Philip. Okay, why, if you were one of those Gentiles and you saw true power of God, okay, see Acts 8 with Simon the sorcerer, you would recognize this is real power. This isn't a trick. These aren't psychoactive drugs or something else. This is real power. And Simon the sorcerer wanted to know what it was all about. I mean, so obviously there was more to this than just something parallel. This promised more than any other quote-unquote religion the world had. This promised more than anything else could offer. Anything else through that? All right, the last question that Doy brings up about historical questions that are asked. Does archaeology help to shed any light on the recorded events? Some of you have study Bibles. In fact, my mom had one when I was growing up, and I loved looking through the back of her study Bible because there would be pictures of Petra. There'd be pictures of these places in like the Greek temple in Ephesus and so forth. And archaeology is one of those, for a lot of people it's a hobby. For a lot of people it just kind of inspires the imagination. But especially religious or spiritual archaeology that relates to the Bible in some way. Okay, and we've talked before about certain aspects that have been proven for a long time. The Hittites, it wasn't believed they were actually a real people. Now it's been proven they were, and they were actually a kingdom of some power during the time of the Old Testament, that the Hittites were kind of a thorn in Israel's side. I mean, there has never been a time where archaeology has disproven what the Bible has said. There is not a single shred of evidence of archaeological evidence that disproves the Bible. Now, what about affirmation? Like things that affirm that this is accurate. We don't have a lot of that in so much as, like what Doy describes, he says, if we're looking for an ancient rock with Jesus' name carved in it, we'll be disappointed. And keep in mind that the Gospels, and for that matter, really the events recorded in the New Testament are a sliver of human history within a sliver of the region of Judea and for that matter of Asia Minor and so forth. Okay, so finding specific things that can be correlated specifically to the first century, that's a tall order to find things like that. Okay, 2,000 years wear and tear on a lot of things. Even the stuff that they do find, a lot of it's so worn off that they can't understand everything a piece of pottery says, for instance. Having said that, what Doy says, most of the findings will be in the form of items like pottery, coins, ruins of buildings. What most of the findings do show is that the world we read about in the New Testament is consistent with what we find in archaeology. Occasionally we do find names, like Pilate's name. There was a stone containing the name of Pilate that confirmed he was in a position of power in Palestine at the time of Jesus. Also, there's an ossuary box. It's a bone box with the name of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas is one of the high priests that's recorded in the New Testament. The point is that archaeological findings in antiquity are consistent with what we read in the Gospels, and that's about all we can expect. So there's nothing here that should cause concern. And again, Doy doesn't bring this out, but there's never been a shred of archaeological evidence that has been definitively proven to be contradictory to what the Bible has said. Now, to be fair, that very first paragraph, actually the first half paragraph or so, Doy does talk about interpretation of artifacts. Rarely does archaeology actually give hard facts. In fact, a lot of times, what we get is actually we find the trash heaps from cities and civilizations and so forth. So really what we're digging through is what people thrown away. And so you're not going to get a lot from that. People interpret and they lay out, this is what life was like here and so forth, when in a lot of ways that's an interpretation of what we found. Okay, we assume that's what it's like in some form or fashion. And there's very little in archaeology in terms of actual hard facts that's incontrovertible. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. So this last section of chapter 21, what about opponents? So if we know what the Christian, we know what followers of Christ, disciples of Christ wrote, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in terms of the Gospels. We know what some of the non-Christians wrote, some of the things that they confirmed, even though they weren't going to corroborate, their goal wasn't to corroborate the Gospels. What about people who were hostile to the Christians? Given the claims of Christianity, one would think that early opponents of Christianity would try to falsify the accounts. Could they do it? Well, certainly they would have the motive to try to falsify the things that were being said and being taught. Some opponents said some malicious things about the disciples. For example, there were some rumors that went around that Christians killed and ate babies in some perverted rituals, as discussed in the late 2nd and 3rd century work of Octavius of Minucius Felix. But opponents never could disprove the central claims of Christianity, namely the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In fact, this is part of what Peter warns about, and Peter's not the only one, about persecution. That sometimes persecution wasn't going to come about simply because you're doing right. Sometimes you're going to be falsely accused of doing wrong. Okay? And blessed are you for enduring persecution because you've done good, and yet people will try to stand up and say these false things about you, but they're not going to be able to show anything because you've done what's right. And they have no basis upon which to actually prove you've done something wrong. But that's not new. Okay, Christians have been dealing with that for a long time. Anything through that point? Doy brings up Peter in Acts chapter 2, verses 22 through 24. And in particular, the statements by Peter, Acts chapter 2, let me switch over here. Acts chapter 2, verses 22 through 24. So this is Peter as he's speaking on the day of Pentecost, and what we sometimes refer to this sermon on the day of Pentecost. He's speaking to these Jews, and here's what he says. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Doy points out the fact that they could have stopped him right there. So we don't know what you're talking about, Peter. We've not seen or heard about any of these miracles that this Jesus of Nazareth has done. Why are you making stuff up? Okay, they don't. In fact, a great many of them are convicted by what Peter says. He goes on to say the fact that you've crucified him, you put him to death, God has raised him up because it wasn't possible that he should be bound by death. And so that point that he makes, that God proved this man to be the Messiah among you. He proved him through these works, through these miracles, as well as his words. And they weren't able to contradict that. In fact, they were convicted by what Peter says. If ever there was a time to falsify Christianity, this was it. Peter indicated that Jesus did his works in their midst, and they knew it. How easy it would have been to say, what are you talking about, Peter? Jesus did no such thing. But they didn't do it. They couldn't do it. Instead of being stopped, the gospel message went out over all the world. I think that's a very important point because we're not just talking about 100 years after the fact. These individuals were there. Okay, a lot of them were actually in Jerusalem for not only for Jesus' crucifixion, but Jesus' entrance to Jerusalem. Remember, he was welcomed just days before his crucifixion as king, laying down palm fronds and so forth as Jesus rode in on a donkey. I mean, so there was not only that, but Jesus, shortly before, maybe just a couple of weeks before he was crucified, what major miracle did he do that ultimately got the Jews actively trying to kill him? Not far from Jerusalem. I think it was like 6 miles from Jerusalem he did this miracle. Do you remember what miracle it was? He raised up Lazarus from the dead. And it was after that miracle, the Sanhedrin said, we've got to do something about this guy. And they sought not only actively to kill Jesus, but who else? Lazarus. We got to get rid of the evidence as well. Okay, now this would have been, for a lot of these Jews, even the Jews who were coming in for Passover, some of them perhaps would have even come in as early enough to have heard about this event. So this is not like this is something that they aren't aware of. Can we trust the Bible? If we can trust any documents of antiquity, we can trust the Bible. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. Question 1. Besides the examples given, can you think of other self-damaging material recorded in the Bible? How does this help the Bible's credibility? Last week when we talked about the self-damaging information that the Gospels share, some in John chapter 6, some servants wouldn't walk with Jesus anymore. They turned away because they couldn't deal with what Jesus said and so forth. We talked about a couple of examples then, but how does having those things recorded, how does that actually help the Bible's credibility? We know at the first, Jesus' brothers didn't really believe he was who he said he was. Why would you record that?
You don't want it to all be rosy.
Well, and I think it's important that it's noted that there were some people who didn't believe. Now, did Jesus' brothers eventually become believers? Yeah, at least as of Acts chapter 1, it sounds like at some point before that, they had become believers. At least James. In fact, we know it was at least 2 because it says his brothers were there. But yeah, at least James, and there's some consideration that Jude, the writer of Jude, was the brother of Jesus as well. But the idea of recording these, what would be considered, again, they're not damaging to Jesus in the least, but the idea of self-damaging. Okay, why record something that shows people turning away from Jesus? Because it goes, and of course from the gospel's perspective, it shows some people couldn't handle the spiritual teaching Jesus taught. They couldn't wrap their head around it. And obviously for us, none of this is self-damaging. From an historical perspective, from a scholarly perspective, they would consider those things self-damaging. And it is credible because people who are just trying to give you the best of things and not give you the other side of it too, they're kind of spinning it or twisting it to make it all sound like Dwayne says, it's all rosy and there was nothing bad and there was no people who didn't believe and everybody was convinced, and we know that wasn't the case. Okay, so that certainly helps to show the reality of the situation, that the writers of the New Testament aren't exaggerating or making stuff up in any way. Anything through question 1? Question 2, what is a real contradiction and how does this differ from a difficulty? What is a real contradiction? Okay, these are 2 mutually exclusive statements. They directly contradict one another, and there is no explanation as to why these things, how to harmonize the 2. Okay, in the Book of Mormon versus the Pearl of Great Price, Joseph Smith went from saying that having multiple wives was wrong and condemning Solomon and David for it, to having multiple wives is right and good, and this is what God wants. So, I mean, it's that type of those are distinctly mutually exclusive statements. You can't reinterpret that unless something has changed between the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price. God changed his mind all of a sudden, and we know that's not how it works. But a real contradiction is these are mutually exclusive. Both can't be true. And there's not a single, not only is there not a single example of that within a single book of the Bible, but there's not a single example of that within all 66 books of the Bible. I want you to think about that for a minute. It's not like they were all written by one person either. From the writers, the prophets, Moses, to Peter, Paul, James, not a single one contradicts any of the others, New or Old Testament. And that's not possible if it were made by humans only. If it were a man-made concoction or a man-made thing, then there's no way it would be that perfect. I mean, even the Book of Mormon has gone through, how many revisions is it now? It's gone through at least 25 revisions that I know of. And I think they've actually revised it a couple more times since, in the last couple of years, I think they revised it some more. Trying to address some of these contradictions. Especially in Utah, the main Book of Mormon, the main Mormon hierarchy or whatever, they have tried to revise the Book of Mormon. Has the Bible ever been revised? Not reworded for modern audiences. I mean revised. Changed. Has the Bible ever been changed? No, it hasn't. In fact, that's one of the points that Doyle's going to make in chapter 22 about the different copies of manuscripts, how that you can take one of the earliest substituted in our modern Bible, and it would read exactly the same. That shows that over 2,000 years, 1,900 years, it hasn't changed. The Book of Mormon has a lot. All right, anything else through that one? Question 3, what is the major issue that affects whether or not someone accepts that the events recorded in Scripture are believable? What's the major issue that affects whether or not somebody accepts that the things that the Bible says are actually true or could be true? It's a person's worldview. How a person sees the world. If they see the world in the possibility that there is a God, not that they believe in God, but that it is possible there is a God, that changes everything. But if they refuse even to consider the possibility, then there's nothing that can be done. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll quickly cover questions 4, 5, and 6 next week and move on to chapter 22, from original autographs to copies, where we kind of go more in depth into the manuscripts of the Bible. Thank you, everybody.